Thank you. This is the moment every 2 years when I realise, rather humblingly, that I could have written a very, very much shorter book. So, here we go. The story of Kim Philby is usually told as a story of ideology and politics. The story I'm going to tell you tonight is actually a story about a very particular British male sort of friendship, forged in war and based largely on alcohol, cricket, and off-colour jokes. It begins not with him. It begins with him, a man most people have never heard of, Nicholas Elliott. Nicholas Elliott was the son of the headmaster of Eton. He was a man completely framed by Eton. He was brought up in circumstances of great privilege and loyalty. He grew into one of those deceptive Englishmen brilliantly described by John le Carré, who could have a forced 12 nervous breakdown standing next to you in the bus queue and you wouldn't be any the wiser. He got his way into MI6 by the old-fashioned way of asking one of his father's friends, who just happened to be in MI6, that he would like to become a spy, an ambition based entirely on having read a lot of spy novels. The response was, "Thank you, dear boy, I'm delighted you've asked me for something so easy." So that was his way into MI6. By the time he got there, this gentleman was already inside. His name was Harold Adrian Russell Philby, better known as Kim. The two of them, at the start of the war, found themselves working shoulder to shoulder in Section 5 of MI6, which is the counterintelligence section. Philby was in charge of the Iberian Peninsula, and Elliott was in charge of occupied Holland. The third part of their friendship was a man called James Jesus Angleton, who was an American Anglophile working for the OSS, the predecessor of the CIA. The three of them formed as close a bond as you could in wartime. But what Elliott didn't know was that simultaneously Philby was working for the NKVD, the predecessor of the KGB. Here you see a handwritten note written by Philby, which was handed to his controller, Boris Crutenshield, which describes exactly what Nicholas Elliott was doing, but is also incredibly rude. Describes him as having prominent lips, black glasses, ugly and rather pig-like to look at. That is the kind of friendship that Philby was conducting at the same time as Elliott loved him like a brother. Now, in order to understand how this was happening, we need to go back a decade from that moment, in 1941, to Cambridge in the 1930s, where the ideological ferment had created a kind of vortex into which people like Philby were sucked. There was no sudden epiphany when Philby became a communist, but he left the university absolutely determined to dedicate himself to the communist cause. This was partly inspired by his closest friend Guy Burgess, homosexual, extremely dangerous, and loud in his advocacy of communism. Another close friend from Cambridge was Donald Maclean, a rising star in the Foreign Office. But the person who actually brought Philby into what would become the KGB is Litzy Friedman, a character very little known about in the story, who he met in Austria in 1934. She was a fully paid-up communist revolutionary, and according to one source, a tremendous little sex pot. Philby seems to have lost his virginity at exactly the same moment that he lost what remained of his political naivety. She recruited him into Soviet intelligence and introduced him to a man named Arnold Deutsch. Now, Deutsch was the main recruiter for the NKVD, Stalin's secret intelligence service. He met Philby on a park bench in Regent's Park. The two became close friends. In fact, Philby regarded Deutsch as the closest friend he'd ever had. Once again, friendship plays a very important part in the story. When Deutsch asked Philby to become a spy, Philby responded, "You do not hesitate to join an elite force." This is one of the keys to Philby, because although he was a lifelong communist, he was also a raging elitist. So Deutsch gave Philby specific instructions that he was to get himself into MI6. This he did by dropping hints around the place, much the same way that Elliott had done, and soon found himself sitting down to tea in St. Ermin's Hotel with Marjorie Maxey. Now, Marjorie Maxey had two jobs, really. She was the treasurer of the Tory party, and simultaneously she was a recruiter for Section D of MI6. The D stands for destruction. That was the sabotage section, so she spent her day raising money for the Tories and her evenings planning to blow up Romanian oil installations. They had a tea. They ended up close friends by the end of it, and Philby, somewhat to his astonishment, found himself inducted into MI6. The only part of the vetting process that took place was a conversation with the deputy head of MI6, who was asked about Philby and said, "I know his people." That is an almost perfect definition of how the Old Boy network worked. So that was how Kim Philby and Nicholas Elliott found themselves fighting to shoulder against a common enemy, but actually on ideologically opposite poles. Very soon after their friendship began, Elliott pulled off an extraordinary coup, one of the greatest intelligence coups ever achieved, really, when he pulled in a German defector called Erich Vermehren, who was quite a senior officer in the Abwehr, German military intelligence, who brought with him, this was in Istanbul, who brought with him a fantastic treasure trove of information about the German intelligence service. So much information, in fact, that it very swiftly led to the complete dismantling of the Abwehr. He was debriefed, Erich Vermehren, in Kim Philby's mother's flat, not far from here, in fact. And he brought with him, as I say, this incredible diary. But he also, and this was at the moment of Elliott's greatest triumph, really. I mean, to have pulled off this coup was considered to have been nothing short of a miracle, really, and he was the toast of MI6. However, there was another side to the story. Erich Vermehren also brought with him a list of anti-Bolshevik Catholic aristocrats in Germany. These were people who could be used to build an anti-communist state in Germany after the war. Now, for obvious reasons, MI6 did not pass this list of people on to Moscow, but Kim Philby did. With the result that when MI5 and MI6 went looking for these people after the war, every single one of them had been murdered or disappeared, because in fact what it meant was that Kim Philby had provided the Moscow hit squads with a ready-made list of their enemies in Germany. That was only the first of a series of brutal betrayals. A few years later, by the time Kim Philby had become head of Soviet counterintelligence, i.e. he had now become responsible for hunting people like him, he learned of the case of Konstantin Volkov, who was a young NKVD officer who offered to defect in Istanbul again, brought with him a promise of the names of dozens of spies working in the West, including one who was the head of a counterintelligence section in MI6. He didn't identify Philby by name, but when this piece of information landed on Philby's desk, he immediately realized that this must be a reference to himself. He tipped off his Soviet controller, and by the time Philby arrived in Istanbul to handle the case in person, Volkov and his wife had disappeared. They were kidnapped, bound hand and foot, sedated, wrapped up in bandages, put on a plane and flown to Moscow, where they were brutally tortured in the basement of the Lubyanka and murdered. Philby's career was going from strength to strength. By 1949, he was appointed the plum posting in Washington as chief liaison with the FBI and the CIA. This meant that he now not only had access to all the secrets, or most of the secrets of MI5 and MI6, he now had all the American secrets as well. As soon as he arrived in Washington, he made friends with his old friend James Jesus Angleton, who had now risen to become head of counterintelligence for the CIA. Angleton was America's chief mole hunter. The two of them began to have lunch once and sometimes twice a week in Harvey's, a very smart downtown restaurant, when Angleton revealed to Philby every single secret of post-war Anglo-American intelligence, all the penetrations behind the Iron Curtain, all the attempts to destabilize communist regimes around the world. I'll just give you one example, the incredibly misnamed Operation Valuable, probably the most valueless operation attempted after the war, which was an attempt to insert insurgents into communist Albania in the hope that they would create a civil war that would eventually lead to the toppling of the Marxist leader of Albania, Enver Hoxha. Philby's information, because Philby was the pivot between MI6 and the CIA, Philby's information on Operation Valuable was so detailed that many of the arriving guerrillas were actually greeted by name. Everyone who landed was either captured or killed within minutes of arrival. The death toll has never been fully established, but there were several hundred guerrillas, and for each guerrilla that was captured or killed, entire families were rounded up. The death toll certainly runs into the hundreds and probably thousands. However, trouble was looming for Philby in the disreputable shape of Guy Burgess. Guy Burgess was constantly in trouble and on the verge of being sacked all the time by the Foreign Office, where he had managed to gain entry. So he was appointed Chief Intelligence Officer and Information Officer in the Washington Embassy. On arrival there, he moved into Kim Philby's flat, unaware that, in fact, a huge code-breaking breakthrough had been achieved by the Americans. The Americans had managed to start reading the Venona traffic. Now, that refers to all the wartime traffic, wireless traffic, that was being passed between and among Moscow intelligence stations. The Venona material revealed that there had been a spy during the war within the British Embassy, and that was clearly Donald Maclean. So Philby sent Burgess back to warn Maclean, telling him, whatever you do, Guy, don't you go too. Guy went too, so the two of them defected to Moscow, putting Philby in an almost impossible position, because as soon as that had happened, he was now a target. He was first interrogated by Dick White, who was head of counterintelligence for MI5, would go on to head MI5 and MI6. They couldn't lay a glove on him because Philby just denied absolutely everything. He was cast into the wilderness, effectively. He lost his job with MI6, and the person who stood by him most vigorously was Nicholas Elliott. Elliott flew back from his foreign posting and began to bombard MI5 with complaints about the way Kim Philby was being treated. He paid for his children to go to school. He got him a new job. He looked after him. He was determined to get him back into the firm. 4 years later, the scandal erupted again when Philby was identified as the third man, the man who had tipped off Burgess and Maclean. But amazingly, the identification of Philby worked to his advantage, because Macmillan was now faced with the problem of either exonerating him or prosecuting him. He stood up in the House of Commons and explained that claimed that Philby had never done anything other than been a loyal servant of the Crown. Philby immediately called a press conference in his mother's flat, the same flat where he had debriefed Vermeeren. Here you see a very young Alan Wicker sitting next to Kim Philby as he held forth. The press conference, which was televised and is still used as a training tool by MI6, was an extraordinary exoneration for Philby. After this, his name was cleared utterly. And Nicholas Elliott decided it was time to bring him back into the firm. He arranged for Kim Philby to get a job as the Beirut correspondent for The Observer and The Economist, and followed him to Beirut as his station chief. So the two men were now working once again in harness, but Philby now as an agent, not as an officer. In this photograph, which was given by a man called Miles Copeland, who you see in the middle, who was a CIA fixer, if you read from right to left, you have MI6, CIA, KGB. The person who finally brought Philby down was a senior executive at Marks and Spencer's called Flora Solomon, who remembered 30 years after the event that Kim Philby had tried to recruit her in the 1930s. When this news came to MI5, it was finally the proof that they'd always needed, that Kim Philby had always been batting for the other side. Nicholas Elliott insisted that he, and only he, should be allowed to go back to Beirut and confront Kim Philby in person. He did this. He greeted him. Kim Philby professed no surprise at all and said, "I rather thought it would be you," when Nicholas Elliott confronted him. After 3 days of close interrogation, Kim Philby finally confessed, or partially confessed, to having been a Soviet spy, which meant that he was now in MI6's control. Nicholas Elliott then left Beirut, and 3 weeks later, Philby vanished, climbed onto a Soviet freighter moored in the harbor in Beirut, and vanished to Moscow. Now, how he did that and why he did that is still debated, but it is pretty clear that, in fact, Nicholas Elliott left the door open to Moscow, because the one thing that MI6 did not want was a public trial of Kim Philby. James Jesus Angleton never recovered from the discovery that his closest friend had, in fact, been feeding secrets to the other side throughout their relationship. He became totally paranoid and partly mad, and did such damage to the CIA that many people thought he himself must in fact be a Soviet spy. Nicholas Elliott also never recovered. His career was destroyed, yet he retained an extraordinary lingering affection for his old friend. And as for Kim Philby himself, he spent the last 25 years of his life in Moscow. He always maintained that he was blissfully happy in the Soviet socialist paradise. In fact, he was miserable and frequently drunk and even suicidal. But in fact, there is a sort of poetic justice here, because the man who had spent his life deceiving others spent his final years deceiving himself. And finally, so we come back to the theme of friendship, because one of the things Kim Philby said in exile was that he missed his friends back in London, particularly Nicholas Elliott. He said, "Friendship is the most important thing of all." Now, you can dismiss that as total humbug from somebody who had made deceiving his friends into an art form, but actually, I think Philby was making a true statement about intelligence and certainly about himself, because nobody better understood the value of friendship. Nobody had been more successful at manipulating his own friendships. Friendship was the reason why Kim Philby survived, and friendship is the reason why Kim Philby was and remains the greatest double agent of all time. Thank you very much.